I used to believe I knew every soul in this town. Every face, every name, every story seemed to repeat like the worn pages of a book I'd been reading since childhood, with no chance for new chapters. But that morning, a morning that should have been just another, I saw a stranger leaning against the pillar of Mr. Whitcomb's grocery store, head bowed, shoulders tense, as if carrying the weight of 1,000 winters. The first thing I noticed wasn't his worn clothes or his disheveled dark hair. It was the scars on his arms, exposed like lines of a story no one dared to ask about. Something inside me, a restlessness I didn't even know existed, stirred in that moment. It was as if time had paused to whisper that, of all the roads I could have chosen, this one, the one that began with him, would change everything. While people hurried past, avoiding even a glance in his direction, I stood there, in front of the store's window, pretending to admire the day's cakes. Every second was an internal struggle, a dance between the voice telling me to walk away and the heart beating faster than usual. He lifted his gaze for a brief moment, and I saw the shadow of a pain so old and silent that I almost shuddered. There was no arrogance or defiance in that look, only a dense loneliness etched deep that no one here seemed willing to touch. And in that instant I realized what I'd always been taught wrong. Not all darkness is dangerous, nor is every mark a shame. Sometimes scars are just proof of who survived. I didn't speak to him that day, nor the next, but it was as if, from that first glance, an invisible bridge had been built between us. Every time I crossed the main street, my entire body seemed to know before I did that he was nearby. And though my hands stayed busy with church duties and my lips kept reciting the right words before the congregation, it was the memory of him that invaded my thoughts, the stranger, the wounded, the improper. I knew I shouldn't want to know more. Pastors' daughters don't stray, they don't question. They don't feel this thirst for mysteries the whole town preferred to ignore. But it was too late. I had already begun to hear the sound of cracks forming in the perfect walls surrounding me. The days that followed were a silent choreography only I seemed to notice. I found ways to pass by where he was. Now at the market, now at the small workshop, where he offered simple repairs for a few coins. We never exchanged words, just quick glances, heavy with a strange gravity no one else saw. I felt foolish and guilty, as if I were betraying everything I'd been taught just by letting him exist within me. But it was inevitable. Every line on his face told a story that screamed in my chest, demanding to be heard, understood. It was a new hunger, a need to see beyond the town's clean facades and uncover the raw truths everyone insisted on hiding beneath polite smiles. I began asking veiled questions almost without realizing it. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why had he chosen our forgotten town to lose himself in? The answers were few, often whispered, and all carried the same tone of suspicion. A murky past, rumors of prison, distorted stories of fights, tragedies, and infamy. No one truly knew, or perhaps no one wanted to know. Instead, it was easier to label him as dangerous, someone to be avoided, as if the scars on his body were undeniable proof that he was a walking mistake. But I, perhaps out of recklessness, perhaps out of something deeper I couldn't yet name, saw something different, an ancient sadness, a man who seemed to carry the weight of sins that might not even be his. It was one late afternoon, when the sky was tinged with gold and the streets began to empty, that we found ourselves closer than ever. I was leaving the church, carrying boxes of donations, when one slipped from my hands, spilling supplies across the sidewalk. Before I could bend down, he was there, silent, helping to gather everything with a gentleness that left me breathless. His hands, strong and scarred, touched each item with a care that contradicted the image the town had painted of him. when our fingers brushed while reaching for the same can. I felt an involuntary jolt, as if my entire body was called back to life. "Thank you," I whispered, lacking the courage to lift my eyes. The words sounded small, ridiculous against the moment that seemed to hold something far greater than simple gratitude. He only nodded, the shadow of a smile passing over his scarred face, before stepping away without a word. But it was too late. Something between us had shifted, something irreversible. I knew my entire life, with its perfect lines drawn by others' hands, was beginning in that moment to crumble from within. After that brief contact, something in me refused to return to normal. I kept attending services, singing hymns, smiling, at social gatherings, but everything felt hollow, as if I had left a vital part of myself on that sidewalk among the scattered cans with the subtle warmth of his touch. At night, lying in the bed that had seen me grow, staring at the ceiling stained with old stories, I wondered how it was possible to yearn so much to know a stranger when my whole life had taught me to fear everything uncertain. Thinking of him was inevitable, like breathing, like praying, except this time my prayer was silent and clandestine, made of questions I didn't dare confess even to God. The town seemed to sense my change before I admitted it to myself. Whispers began to surface, first in jest, then laced with something darker. I heard the veiled comments on street corners, the conversations that stopped when I passed. People who once greeted me with wide smiles now lowered their eyes as if I carried something contagious. My mother watched me with growing concern, while my father, the revered Pastor Pryor, began delivering fiercer sermons about the dangers of bad company and the importance of keeping one's soul and intentions pure. But inside me, something stubbornly rebelled, something no harsh word seemed able to uproot. I told myself I could control it, that it was enough to avoid seeing him again, that filling my days with good deeds, church commitments, and visits to needy families would suffice. But it was a lie. The truth was that every step I took to distance myself from him only made my heart pound harder, as if bound by invisible threads, pulling me back to the memory of those eyes, that fleeting touch. It was inevitable, inescapable, like rain before, a storm. I felt something big and irrevocable approaching. And then on a stifling Sunday afternoon, when the entire town seemed dulled by heat and routine, I saw him again, standing across the street, leaning against a fence, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that froze my entire body. This time I didn't look away. I didn't pretend to ignore him. For long seconds we stared at each other as if the world around us had vanished, as if only the two of us and the silent choice hovering between us existed. And in that moment, without words, without promises, without excuses, I knew it was already too late to turn back. From that day on, our encounters stopped being mere coincidences. We didn't plan anything, didn't exchange hidden notes, but there was a force, silent and undeniable, guiding us to the same places, as if the earth itself had decided to push us toward each other. Sometimes it was at the market, among tiki, shelves of forgotten canes. Other times on the trail near the lake, where few ventured beyond the town's fences. We never touched. We rarely spoke. But the way his eyes met mine said everything. He saw me. Not the perfect pastor's daughter, not the symbol of the community's moral hope, but the woman, whole, divided, hungry for something I didn't even know how to describe. And it was in that hunger, that thirst for truth, that everything began to change, one cloudy Wednesday afternoon. I was collecting old books from the church's small library when I heard steady footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. My body knew before my mind, goosebumps rising on every inch of skin, as if touched by an invisible current. I turned slowly, my heart beating in places I didn't know existed. He stood there a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his gaze heavy with something so raw, so human it took my breath away. "You shouldn't talk to me," was all he said, his voice hoarse, low, as if trying to convince himself more than me. I should have agreed. I should have turned and walked away as much of me begged me to do. But I didn't. I took a step toward him, then another. And in the silence that formed between us, I understood that some things cannot be undone, that certain choices don't ask for permission, they simply happen. "Maybe it's too late for that," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt inside. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, looking away for a moment as if carrying an internal battle that never ended. And in that small gesture, I saw more than any scar on his skin could tell. I saw fear, not fear of others, but fear of himself, of what he might cause me, of what he might awaken and destroy. When he raised his hand, hesitant, to brush a strand of hair from my face, there was no seduction in that touch. There was reverence, a wounded gentleness that broke me inside. And it was there, under the silent walls of the forgotten library, that everything changed. There were no stolen kisses, no fervent promises, only the inevitable recognition that somehow our souls were already entwined long before our bodies dared to draw near. After that day in the library, there was no room for lies within me. Every moment our paths crossed was a spark that ignited slowly, dangerously, consuming the certainties that once protected me. Nathaniel kept a respectful distance, as if afraid of breaking me, as if he considered himself unworthy of even dreaming of touching me again. But the silence between us was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, wordless promises, a contained heat dancing in the narrow space that separated us. And even without scandalous gestures, even without forbidden kisses, I knew we were already a fire ready to spiral out of control. It didn't take long for the town's watchful eyes to notice. First, it was the church ladies, whispering disapprovingly as I passed. Then came the open looks of reproach, the closed faces during services, the social invitations that silently stopped coming. At home, the air grew heavy as lead. My mother asked questions disguised as advice, and my father, the one who taught me from childhood to distinguish right from wrong, looked at me as if he no longer recognized me. I tried to hide the truth, swore to myself I could be strong enough to keep Nathaniel a secret in my heart, but every time I thought of his hoarse voice, his broken and real demeanor, the defenses I built crumbled effortlessly. It was on a stifling afternoon, as I ventured down the lake trail seeking a bit of peace, that everything came to a head. Nathaniel was waiting for me, leaning against an old tree, his body tense as if every second spent there was a battle lost. I approached slowly, feeling the weight of what we carried between us. Before I could say anything, he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a decision that hurt more than any rejection. "We can't keep doing this, Evangeline," he said, not even looking into my eyes. "It's not fair to you. They'll never allow it. I'll never be enough." Each word was a knife plunged into the raw flesh of my will, but more painful than his words was the silent truth they carried. I knew. From the beginning, I knew that this love, if it had any chance, would have to fight against the entire world. Even so, in that moment all I wanted was to scream that it was too late, that I already loved him with an absurd and silent strength, as inevitable as the sunrise. Instead, I just stood there, staring at him, feeling my hands clench into useless fists at my sides. "I don't need permission to feel what I feel," I whispered, my voice choked. But Nathaniel only smiled, a smile so sad, so resigned, that it broke something inside me, before turning his back and disappearing among the trees, taking a piece of my heart with him. After he walked away that gloomy evening, something in me collapsed for good. I tried to cling to old routines like a lifeline, but it was useless. Every prayer uttered in church, every forced smile at family dinners, was just an empty performance, a mechanical repetition of a life that no longer belonged to me. Inside me, the cracks widened, as if my soul was splintering into smaller and smaller fragments, until nothing seemed to make sense anymore. I woke in the middle of the night, with the bitter taste of regret in my throat, with the memory of Nathaniel's eyes haunting me, calling me, and in the silence of the early hours, I wondered if it was truly wrong to love someone who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, or if the real wrong was continuing to live a lie just to fit the expectations of those who would never understand what was inside me. It didn't take long for the town to decide to act. One afternoon, while helping prepare for a local festivity, I was called to an impromptu meeting at the church. My father's gaze, firm and unyielding from the pulpit, said everything before he even began to speak. It wasn't just a warning, it was a sentence. Words like dishonor, danger, and deviation were thrown like stones disguised as concern. They spoke as if they were saving me, as if they wanted to protect me from a dark fate, but each sentence was a chain tightening around my throat. Deep down I knew it wasn't about love or salvation, it was about control, about keeping up appearances, about erasing anything that threatened the comfortable order they had chosen to live in. When my father, his voice heavy with sadness and authority, demanded that I make a choice, the family, the faith, and the future they had planned for me, or certain ruin beside a man marked by the scars of his past, I felt the ground vanish beneath my feet. My entire body trembled, but my voice, when it came, was surprisingly steady. "I need to think," was all I could say before leaving the room, feeling every gaze burning into my back like invisible blades. But deep down, I already knew the answer. The question was never about Nathaniel nor the town. It was about me, about who I truly was beyond expectations, beyond masks. And perhaps, just perhaps, loving that broken man was the first true act of my entire life. Time passed, but it didn't take away the absence Nathaniel left behind. On the contrary, each day without him felt like an added weight on my shoulders, a deepening void like roots in dry soil. I went on living as a shadow of myself, fulfilling tasks, smiling when expected, murmuring rehearsed words that no longer meant anything. But in my chest, a silent flame burned, faint, persistent, impossible to extinguish. And even when I tried to convince myself it was better this way, that perhaps what we had felt was just a youthful fantasy, all it took was closing my eyes to feel the phantom touch of his hands, the memory of the gaze that pierced through every layer I'd never let anyone see. It was on a stormy afternoon that everything changed. The sky was heavy, almost oppressive, and the church bells rang earlier than usual, drawing the entire town's attention. A fire had broken out in the old wing of the orphanage, an ancient building held together by empty promises and rotten beams. When I arrived at the scene, a small crowd was already gathered, watching in helpless silence as black smoke consumed the sky. The younger children were being evacuated in a hurry, but desperate screams indicated that some were still trapped. Inside, no one moved. No one dared to cross the flames until I saw him, Nathaniel. He emerged from the crowd like a specter of courage, not hesitating for a second. Without looking around, without caring about the murmurs, he ran toward the flaming doors, ignoring the shouts trying to stop him. And in that moment, watching him risk his life to save souls the world had already forgotten, I understood with brutal clarity everything I had always known deep down. Those who carry deep scars also carry a capacity to love that transcends fear, logic, even the instinct for survival. Time seemed to stretch as we waited, eyes fixed on the thick smoke swallowing the structure. Then, as if fate itself pushed him out, he appeared again, carrying 2 children in his arms, stumbling, coughing, his clothes torn and face covered in soot. The crowd erupted in shouts, in movement. I ran without thinking, pushing through the chaos, tears already blurring my vision. When I reached him, Nathaniel was on his knees, struggling to breathe. And yet, when his eyes met mine, there, amid pain and ashes, he smiled. Without thinking, without fear, without the weight of anything else in the world, I knelt before him and embraced him. An embrace that was more than a gesture. It was a silent promise. He tried to pull away, still caught in the old habit of protecting even from himself. But this time, I wouldn't allow it. I held his face in my trembling hands and saw, through the soot and wounds, the man I loved with all the strengths and freedom that were finally mine. That night, the entire town seemed different. Perhaps it was the fire, the smoke, or the simple fact that for the first time in a long while, everyone saw the truth with their own eyes and could no longer pretend they didn't know it. Nathaniel wasn't the monster they had painted in whispers and sidelong glances. He was the man who ran into the flames while everyone else stepped back. The man who put the lives of children above his own. The man who, even wounded, still tried to smile to calm those around him. But I knew, for many it still wouldn't be enough. Scars don't vanish from the skin, and for some, they don't vanish from the eyes that prefer the comfort of ignorance. I stayed by his side the entire time, ignoring the looks, ignoring the hands that tried to pull me back to the comfortable line of familiar faces. There was no going back to the version of me they accepted. I had already crossed an invisible line, and for the first time, I felt no fear, only a solid, unshakable certainty. If loving Nathaniel meant being exiled from the safety that had surrounded me my whole life, so be it. I preferred wounded freedom to blind comfort. My father tried to stop me. The next morning he called me to the church office, his face serious, heavy with an almost pious sadness. He spoke of duty, forgiveness, redemption, as if my love were a disease that could be cured with prayers and repentance. But as he spoke, I felt a silent peace spreading through my chest. I loved him, not despite the scars, not despite the mistakes. I loved him for all of it, because he was true in a world full of masks. When I finally rose from that hard chair, I lifted my gaze and saw the surprise on my father's face, because he knew, even before I said a word, that he had lost the daughter he had tried to mold. With a steady, calm voice, I simply said, "I choose to follow my own path." And then, without looking back, I crossed the church that had seen me grow, hearing the echoes of footsteps that were now mine, only mine, until I passed through the doors and felt for the first time the wind of freedom hitting my face, without asking permission. I found Nathaniel by the lake, in the place where months ago our paths began to intertwine in silence. He was turned away from me, sitting on the damp grass, his shoulders still marked by the battle against the flames, his body still as if carrying alone the weight of all the choices he thought he had imposed on me. For a moment I stood there, watching him, feeling the wind tousle my hair, hearing the calm sound of water against the stones. And I knew, with an almost cruel clarity, that this was where everything would begin again, or end. It would depend only on the courage of both of us. I walked toward him without announcing my arrival. When I got close enough, he turned his face, and what I saw tightened my chest. It wasn't just physical exhaustion or the barely healed wounds. It was fear, the desperate fear that I had come to say goodbye, the fear that he had been right all along in believing he would never deserve to be chosen. Before any word could form between us, I knelt before him, touched his face with both hands, and forced him to look at me. "I chose you," I whispered, and there was no tremor in my voice, only the raw truth. etched in every beat of my heart. Not because the world allowed me to, not because it was easy, but because my soul knew from the first glance that it was you. And I won't apologize anymore for loving what is true. Nathaniel closed his eyes as if my words were more than he could bear. I saw his lips tremble, saw the internal struggle etched in every line of his weary face. But when he opened his eyes again, the storm had dissipated. All that remained was a silent surrender, a shameless, unreserved yielding. He pulled me into his arms with a desperate gentleness, as if still afraid I might slip away, and then held me as if the entire world were collapsing around us. And it no longer mattered. There, amid the scent of wet earth and the murmur of water, our hearts met again. Not with grandiose promises or eternal vows, but with something far rarer, the conscious choice to belong to each other, despite the scars, because of the scars, through everything we were and would still be. And in that moment I knew there was no purer redemption than loving someone exactly as they were, and being loved the same way. Years have passed since that afternoon by the lake, but even now, sometimes, I wake in the middle of the night and need to reach out to touch him, to make sure he's real. That this life we built wasn't just a beautiful dream conjured by longing. Nathaniel is always there, the warmth of his body anchoring mine, his hair now slightly grayer at the temples, his eyes still heavy with all the history that once frightened me, and that now embraces me. The town never fully accepted us. Some smiles remained cold, some doors stayed closed. But we learned that true belonging isn't measured by the streets we walk, but by the arms that welcome us at the end of the day. We built our home by the lake's edge, where the world feels distant and time has a different rhythm. We tend the land, create our own routines, and when the sun sets, it's common to find him sitting on the porch, carving pieces of wood as he did in the early days. His quiet way of giving thanks for the life we dared to choose against all odds. And I watching him, every line marked by time, every imperfect smile, know without a doubt, if I had to live it all again, every tear, every rupture, every battle against what seemed impossible, I would. Because in the end, it was through the scars, his and mine, that love found its way.